I'm 28 and I work as a security guard downtown, typically finishing my shift at 11 p.m. Every night I take the train home. One night, about a third of the way home, the train came to an unexpected halt. We were informed that there had been an accident on the tracks ahead and that there wouldn't be any more trains for the night. Frustrated, we all got off the train and started walking, complaining about how far we still had to go. As we trudged along, two other guys in security uniforms, who had been on the train with me, mentioned that their car was just a few blocks away. They said they were heading in the direction of my neighborhood and offered me a ride. By this time, it was nearing midnight, and I still had a long way to go. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Now, before you think it was foolish to accept a ride from strangers, let me explain. As a small woman, I would never normally accept a ride from two unknown men, but they were also security guards. In my city, there's an unspoken rule among security personnel to look out for one another, regardless of the company we work for. So, I assumed these guys were just trying to help a fellow guard out. As we walked towards their car, one of the guys started acting strangely. He seemed drunk. This made me uneasy, but I reassured myself that he wasn't the one driving, and the other guy seemed fine. How wrong I was. When we reached the car, I realized it wasn't a car at all. It was a van. One of the guys apparently lived in it. The sight of that van sent alarm bells ringing in my head. It looked exactly like the kind of van you'd imagine a serial killer driving. I even thought to myself, this looks like a murder van. Little did I know how accurate that thought would be. Here's where I made my biggest mistake. Instead of following my instincts and running away, I got into the van. It was one of those moments where social conditioning kicked in. Women, especially, are often conditioned not to make a scene or offend others, even when we're scared. It's a stupid and dangerous mindset, but in that moment, it was stronger than my sense of self-preservation. I froze, afraid of what might happen if I tried to back out. So there I was, sitting in the front seat of a van with two strangers, one of whom was acting more erratic by the minute. The drunk guy started ranting about wanting Trump back in office, race riots, and other crazy, unhinged topics. Meanwhile, I was quietly freaking out, rapidly texting my partner about the bad decision I had made. I genuinely feared that I might not make it home that night. The only smart thing I did was not tell them my exact address. I had them drop me off a few streets away from my house and took a back route home, even cutting through someone's yard to be safe. 2 days later, I was at work when I saw a news report. At 11 a.m. the day after my terrifying ride, another security guard had been shot and killed in the labor and delivery ward of a hospital near my house. My heart nearly stopped when I read who the shooter was. It was the crazy guy from the van, the one who had terrified me that night. The driver, the one who had given me a ride, turned out to be the shooter's getaway driver. I started hyperventilating as the realization hit me. That could have been me. So, let my story be a warning. Never, ever accept a ride from strangers. This is the story of two friends, Amir and Wakar, who had known each other since their school days. One day, they decided to grab a bite together after work. They chose McDonald's, their childhood favorite. It was around 10 p.m., and both friends met at McDonald's. The atmosphere was as comfortable as ever. Bright lights, kids playing, and people lined up at the counter. Amir ordered his usual Big Mac, while Wakar opted for a Filet-O-Fish. They decided to sit at a table in the corner to enjoy their meal. As they reached the table, Amir noticed that a man at the nearby table was staring at them. The man was middle-aged, with disheveled hair and a strange glint in his eyes. Amir pointed him out to Wakar, but Wakar shrugged it off, saying Amir was probably overthinking it and should just ignore the man. They began eating, but Amir couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man was still watching them, occasionally smiling, which made Amir feel uneasy. Wakar tried to lighten the mood by talking about old times, but Amir's attention kept drifting back to the man. A few minutes later, the man suddenly stood up and walked over to Amir and Wakar's table. In a soft voice, he asked, "You guys here for a meal too?" There was something about the way he spoke that made Amir uncomfortable. Wakar quickly responded, "Yes, and you?" The man smiled and said, "Yes, I just got here. I come here often. But you two seem different." This comment left both friends puzzled. Amir asked, "What do you mean? How are we different?" The man, with an eerie smile, replied, "You two are always together, but today, like last time, your story is about to take a different turn." Hearing this, Amir's heart began to race. He looked at Wakar and saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. The man suddenly stood up and walked out of the restaurant. Amir and Wakar sat there, stunned and confused. Breaking the silence, Wakar asked, "Amir, who was that guy?" Amir shook his head. "I don't know, but we should get out of here quickly." They both got up, leaving their food behind, and rushed out of McDonald's. As they walked toward the car, Amir glanced back and saw the same man standing in the distance, shrouded in darkness, with that same unsettling smile. They hurried into the car and drove away. The entire drive was silent, but there was a lingering sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. That night, Amir and Wakar decided they wouldn't be going back to McDonald's anytime soon. And that man who had ruined their night never quite left their minds. Raida and Sanaa were best friends, the kind who could finish each other's sentences. One evening, after a long day of work, they decided to unwind by taking a late-night drive around the city. It was something they used to do in college, and it felt nostalgic to bring the old tradition back. The city was quiet, with only a few cars on the road. They drove through familiar streets, laughing and reminiscing about old times. After a while, they found themselves near the outskirts of the city, where the streets were lined with trees and the only light came from the moon. "Let's go to that old park we used to hang out in," Sanaa suggested. Raida nodded in agreement, and they headed towards the park. The park was an old favorite, a place where they used to spend hours talking under the stars. When they arrived, the park was deserted as expected at that hour. They parked the car and got out, walking towards the swings that creaked softly in the breeze. The air was cool and the night was still. Raida felt a strange sense of calm, but also something unsettling, as if the silence was too perfect. They sat on the swings, gently swaying back and forth, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound from the bushes nearby. Rida looked at Sanaa, who shrugged. Probably just a cat, but the rustling continued, getting louder. It didn't sound like a cat. The sound was heavier, like footsteps. Rida's heart started to race. "Maybe we should go," she whispered. Sanaa, sensing her friend's unease, nodded. As they stood up, the rustling stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, and then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and thin, with a hood pulled low over his face. He stood still, just watching them. The swings creaked in the silence. Rida grabbed Sanaa's hand. "Let's go. Now." They started to walk quickly towards the car, trying not to look back. The man didn't move, just stood there, watching them. They reached the car and hurried inside, locking the doors. Rida fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking, but managed to start the engine. As they drove away, both of them looked back and saw the man still standing there, in the exact same spot, staring after them. They drove in silence for a while, the tension thick in the air. Finally, Sanaa spoke. "Who do you think he was?" Rida shook her head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Let's just get out of here." As they reached the city limits and the familiar streets came back into view, they both started to relax. But the image of the man in the park, standing motionless in the shadows, stayed with them. That night, as Rida lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She checked her phone, and her blood ran cold when she saw a message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have left so soon. We weren't done talking." Rida stared at the message, her heart pounding. She immediately called Sanaa, who answered after just one ring. "I got the same message," Sanaa whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Rida didn't know. All she knew was that their quiet night out had turned into something far more sinister. And whoever that man was, he wasn't done with them yet. It was a chilly evening, and the city lights flickered like stars against the dark sky. Amina and Zara, two close friends, decided to meet up after a long week at work. They hadn't had a chance to catch up properly in days, so they chose to meet at their favorite Starbucks downtown. The cafe was warm and inviting, with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The soft hum of conversations and the occasional clatter of cups created a cozy atmosphere. Amina and Zara found a corner table, away from the hustle, where they could talk in peace. As they settled in, Zara ordered a caramel macchiato while Amina went for her usual vanilla latte. They chatted about their day, sharing stories about annoying coworkers and weekend plans. The conversation flowed easily, just like it always did between them. After a while, the door to the cafe opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, with a heavy coat wrapped tightly around him and a scarf covering most of his face. He looked around the cafe, his eyes scanning each table, before finally heading to the counter to order. Something about him caught Amina's attention, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She nudged Zara. "Do you know that guy?" Zara glanced over but shook her head. "No, never seen him before." "Why?" Amina hesitated. I don't know. There's just something off about him. He seems tense. Zara shrugged, trying to dismiss Amina's concern. It's probably just the cold. Let's not worry about it. But Amina couldn't shake the feeling. The man had ordered his coffee but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood near the entrance, his eyes still darting around the room. Amina noticed he kept glancing at their table, making her increasingly uneasy. Maybe we should go, Amina suggested, her voice low. Zara looked at her friend, sensing her discomfort. Okay, if you want to, let's just finish our coffee first. They tried to continue their conversation, but Amina's eyes kept drifting back to the man by the door. He was now looking directly at them, his gaze intense and unblinking. Zara noticed it too and began to feel the same unease. Just as they were about to leave, the man suddenly moved towards them. He walked with purpose, his eyes locked on Amina. Her heart raced, and she instinctively reached for her phone. But before she could do anything, the man stopped at their table and pulled out something from his pocket. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. He placed it on the table and without a word, turned around and left the cafe. Amina and Zara stared at the note, unsure of what to do. Zara finally picked it up and unfolded it. The message was scrawled in shaky handwriting. You're not safe here. Leave now. They looked at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. Without a second thought, they grabbed their things and rushed out of the cafe, not even bothering to finish their drinks. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran down their spines. They quickly walked to Zara's car, their heads on a swivel, looking for any sign of the man or anyone else who might be following them. Once they were safely inside the car, Zara locked the doors and started the engine. Who do you think he was? Amina asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out, Zara replied, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As they drove away, both of them kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man following them. But the streets were empty, and soon the Starbucks was far behind them. Amina's phone buzzed, and she nearly jumped. It was a message from an unknown number. You did the right thing by leaving. Be careful. Amina showed the message to Zara, and they both felt a mixture of relief and fear. They didn't know who the man was or why he had warned them, but they knew one thing for sure. That cozy evening at Starbucks had turned into something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. It was another exhausting day at work. My shift had dragged on longer than usual, and by the time I finally clocked out, I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. As I walked towards the train station, the city lights blurred in my tired eyes. All I wanted was to get home, kick off my shoes, and sink into the couch. The train ride was quiet, almost eerily so. I found a seat by the window and leaned my head against the cool glass, trying to stay awake. The rhythmic sound of the train on the tracks was almost hypnotic, and I felt myself drifting off for a moment. But the jolt of the train stopping at my station brought me back to reality. I dragged myself out of the seat and made my way home, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled with the keys, my hands barely cooperating. The moment I stepped inside, I let out a deep sigh of relief. The silence of my apartment was comforting, a stark contrast to the noise and stress of the day. I tossed my bag onto the couch and headed straight for the kitchen. I wasn't even hungry, just too tired to care about food. I grabbed a glass of water and gulped it down, hoping it would give me a bit of energy, but it didn't. I looked around my apartment, the usual mess greeting me as if to remind me of all the things I still had to do. But right now, all I could think about was sleep. I didn't even bother turning on the lights as I made my way to the bedroom. The dim glow from the streetlights outside was enough to guide me. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed, not even caring that I was still in my work clothes. Lying there in the darkness, I could feel the tension slowly leaving my body. The stress, the fatigue, all of it started to melt away as I closed my eyes. The familiar scent of my pillow, the softness of the sheets, it all felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the day. My mind started to wander, but I didn't fight it. I just let the thoughts drift in and out, not holding on to anything for too long. Before I knew it, I was on the edge of sleep. My body felt heavy, but in a comforting way, like I was sinking into the mattress. And as I finally gave in to the exhaustion, I realized that no matter how tough the day had been, coming home was the one thing that made it all worth it. Because no matter how tired I was, this was my space, my refuge, where I could just be me. And with that thought, I drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready to face whatever the next day had in store. It was one of those evenings where the rain seemed to fall endlessly, drumming against the windows in a steady rhythm. I'd been looking forward to this quiet night at home all week. Everyone else was out of town for the weekend, and I was left alone in the house. It wasn't often that I had the place all to myself, and the idea of a peaceful night in was incredibly appealing. As soon as I got home from work, I kicked off my shoes and threw my damp coat over the back of a chair. The scent of wet earth and rain was faintly lingering in the house, a reminder of the storm outside. I made myself a cup of hot cocoa, the kind that warms you from the inside out, and settled into my favorite spot on the couch with a good book. The house was quiet except for the soothing patter of rain against the roof. Occasionally, the wind would pick up, making the trees outside sway and creak. I loved the sound of the rain. It felt like a comforting blanket that wrapped around the house, making everything feel more intimate and cozy. Halfway through my book, I heard a strange noise, an unexpected clatter that made me jump. I paused, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe something from outside making a noise against the window. I tried to shrug it off, but the peace I'd been enjoying was momentarily disrupted. To distract myself, I decided to check on the lights and make sure everything was in order. I went through the house, flicking on lamps and checking the locks on the doors. Everything seemed fine. It was just the rain playing tricks on my mind. I returned to the couch and tried to lose myself in the book again, but my focus was fractured. The power flickered once, then twice, and then went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, with only the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I groaned in frustration, setting the book aside. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, its beam cutting through the darkness as I moved around the house. I checked the fuse box in the basement, but everything seemed normal. No tripped switches or obvious issues. I was starting to get a little anxious, but I reminded myself it was just a power outage. It wasn't anything to get too worked up about. I decided to light a few candles to create some ambience and make the darkness less oppressive. As I was placing candles around the living room, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, a thump that came from the direction of the kitchen. My heart raced. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe something had fallen in the kitchen. I took a deep breath and made my way towards the sound. I flicked the flashlight towards the kitchen, its beam dancing across the darkened room. Everything looked normal, but I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. The wind must have pushed it open when it picked up. I closed it and checked the lock, but my hands were trembling slightly. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. I went back to the living room, lit more candles, and decided to watch a movie on my laptop. The storm outside was growing fiercer, with the wind howling and the rain pounding against the windows with increased intensity. It was the kind of storm that makes everything outside feel distant and foreign. As I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, the lights suddenly came back on. Relief washed over me, and I thought about how nice it would be to enjoy some normalcy again. I tried to focus on the movie, but the strange noises and the eerie ambience of the storm kept interrupting my concentration. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I made my way to bed, feeling the exhaustion from the day catch up with me. The sound of the storm outside was soothing now, more like a lullaby than a disturbance. As I lay in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, the rhythmic patter of the rain on the window and the occasional rumble of thunder created a comforting backdrop. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard a knock on the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could it be at this hour, and with this storm raging outside? I hesitated, listening intently, but there was only silence. I got up cautiously and went to the door, flashlight in hand, and peeked through the peephole. The only thing I could see was the blurred outline of the rain. I opened the door slowly, only to find that no one was there. The storm was the only thing greeting me. I stepped outside briefly, looking around, but there was no sign of anyone. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. I decided that the storm had definitely played tricks on my mind tonight. I climbed back into bed, trying to relax. As I finally drifted off to sleep, the storm outside continued its relentless symphony, a reminder that even when alone, the world outside never truly stops. And as the night wore on, with the rain continuing to fall and the wind howling softly, I realized that sometimes being home alone with just the storm for company can be a strangely comforting experience. It's a reminder of how the small moments of solitude can be both unsettling and profoundly peaceful at the same time. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation I hadn't anticipated. After a long day of meetings and travel, I was heading back home when my car broke down on a deserted stretch of highway. It was already late, and with the weather taking a turn for the worse, I had no choice but to find somewhere to stay for the night. I spotted a small, neon-lit motel up ahead. The sign, flickering intermittently in the rain, read vacancy. I pulled into the parking lot, grateful for the refuge. The motel had an old-fashioned charm, one of those places that seem to exist in their own time capsule, untouched by the modern world. The office was dimly lit, with a small bell on the counter that jingled as I entered. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, greeted me. After a brief check-in process, he handed me a key and directed me to my room. I could tell that this place had seen better days, but at that moment, any place with a roof over my head was a welcome sight. The room was exactly what you'd expect from an older motel: simple furnishings, faded wallpaper, and a faint musty smell. But it was clean enough, and it had a certain nostalgic quality to it. I settled into the room, took a quick shower to wash off the day's grime, and then wrapped myself in a cozy blanket on the bed. The rain outside was relentless, pounding against the window with a soothing rhythm. I switched on the TV, but the channels were mostly static and outdated. Instead, I pulled out a book I'd been meaning to read and lost myself in its pages. The rain and the occasional rumble of thunder outside created a perfect backdrop for a quiet night in. As the night wore on, I noticed something odd. The door to the adjacent room, which was separated from mine by a thin wall, seemed to creak open and shut intermittently. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or if someone was moving around in there. My curiosity got the better of me, but I decided not to investigate. It was probably nothing, and I didn't want to get involved in anything that might disrupt my peaceful evening. Around midnight, I decided to turn in for the night. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a series of soft knocks on my door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be knocking at this hour in a place like this? I hesitated, then carefully made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door cautiously and looked around the empty parking lot. Everything seemed normal. I closed the door and locked it, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I decided to stay up a bit longer, reading by the light of a small lamp. Eventually, I managed to drift off to sleep. The rain continued to fall, and the rhythmic sound was oddly comforting. In the middle of the night, I was abruptly awoken by a loud bang, a noise that seemed to come from the hallway. I sat up, heart racing, but when I checked, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, and I woke up the next morning feeling a bit disoriented but mostly refreshed. I packed up my things and checked out, thanking the clerk as I left. The storm had cleared, and the morning sun was beginning to peek through the clouds. As I drove away from the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just experienced something out of the ordinary. The old-fashioned charm of the place, combined with the strange noises and my overactive imagination, had made for a memorable, if slightly eerie, night. Sometimes, these unexpected detours can turn into stories we tell ourselves and others, adding a touch of mystery and intrigue to an otherwise ordinary trip. The motel stay had been an adventure of its own, and despite the odd occurrences, it was an experience I wouldn't soon forget. A few nights ago, I found myself in a situation that felt like it came straight out of a quirky adventure movie. I'd had a long day at work and was desperately in need of a few things for the weekend. By the time I got off, it was past 11 p.m., and I knew Walmart was my only option if I wanted to avoid the crowds and get everything done in one trip. The store was relatively empty when I walked in, which was just how I liked it. The fluorescent lights cast a bright, sterile glow over the aisles, and the hum of the air conditioning was the only sound accompanying the occasional beeping of the register or the shuffle of someone's footsteps. I grabbed a shopping cart and began my hunt for items on my list. The first few aisles went smoothly. I picked up the essentials: milk, bread, and eggs, then moved on to the household items. As I strolled down the aisles, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was. The lack of noise gave the store a strange, almost surreal atmosphere. I was starting to relax, enjoying the calmness of my late-night shopping spree, when I stumbled upon something unexpected. In the pet supplies aisle, I found a stray kitten curled up on a shelf, looking lost and forlorn. It was a tiny, gray ball of fur with wide, curious eyes. My heart went out to it immediately. I knew Walmart had a policy against animals in the store, and I didn't want to leave the kitten behind, but I had no idea what to do. I decided to take the kitten with me to the customer service desk. As I walked through the store with the little furball nestled in my arms, I couldn't help but feel like I was in a scene from a feel-good movie. People glanced at me with a mix of curiosity and amusement as I made my way to the desk. When I arrived, the staff at customer service were just as surprised as I was. They took the kitten and assured me they would contact a local rescue organization to come and take care of it. I felt a bit relieved, knowing the kitten would be in good hands. They thanked me for bringing it to their attention and even offered me a small discount on my purchases as a token of their appreciation. With the kitten situation resolved, I resumed my shopping. The store seemed even quieter than before, and the usual bustling energy of Walmart was replaced with a calm that felt almost otherworldly. I finished my list and headed to the checkout, where the cashier greeted me with a friendly smile. As I loaded my groceries into the car, I glanced back at the store, which was now starting to empty out completely. It was a peculiar feeling, being in a place so typically busy and yet so serene. The incident with the kitten had turned an ordinary late-night errand into an unexpected adventure. Driving home, I reflected on the night's events. It was one of those moments that made me realize how small acts of kindness and unexpected encounters can turn a mundane task into something memorable. It was a reminder that even in the most routine of places, life has a way of surprising us. When I finally got home, I unloaded my groceries and settled in for a quiet night. The kitten's plight had been the highlight of my night, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing I had helped make a difference, even in a small way. It's funny how the late-night trips to places like Walmart can sometimes turn into adventures. What started as a simple grocery run had become a story I'd remember for a long time, adding a touch of unexpected excitement to an otherwise ordinary evening. A couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to take a cross-country trucking job. It was something I'd never done before, and I was both excited and a bit nervous about the whole experience. The job involved transporting cargo from one coast to the other, and the route would take me through some stunning landscapes and remote areas. I picked up the truck early in the morning, a massive rig with all the bells and whistles. It was my home for the next few days, complete with a cozy sleeping compartment and a small kitchenette. As I drove out of the depot, I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer size of the vehicle and the responsibility it entailed. The first leg of the trip was through rolling hills and scenic farmland. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a gentle breeze. I had a few hours of driving before my first scheduled break, and I used the time to get accustomed to the truck's controls and the road. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the steady swaying of the truck made for a surprisingly calming experience. Around midday, I stopped at a truck stop for fuel and a quick bite. It was a bustling place with other truck drivers filling up their tanks and grabbing meals. I struck up a conversation with a couple of fellow drivers who shared some great stories about their own adventures on the road. It was clear that the trucking community had a unique camaraderie built on shared experiences and mutual respect. After my break, I continued my journey, heading towards the mountains. The terrain changed dramatically as I climbed higher, with winding roads and breathtaking views. The truck handled the steep inclines well, though I had to be extra cautious with my speed. The landscape was awe-inspiring, with snow-capped peaks and lush valleys stretching out as far as the eye could see. As evening approached, I reached a small town nestled in the mountains and decided to stop for the night. I found a quiet truck stop with a few other rigs parked for the night. After securing the truck and grabbing a simple dinner, I retired to the sleeping compartment. The night was peaceful, with the distant sound of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote adding to the ambience. The next morning, I was back on the road, heading towards the desert. The contrast was stark. Where the mountains were lush and cool, the desert was dry and scorching. I had to keep a close eye on the temperature gauge, ensuring that the truck's engine stayed within a safe range. The vast, open spaces and endless stretches of road were mesmerizing in their own way. By the time I reached the halfway point of my journey, I was in need of another break. I stopped at a rest area and took a moment to stretch my legs and enjoy the scenery. There was something profoundly serene about the wide open spaces and the solitude of the road. It gave me a chance to reflect on the journey so far and appreciate the freedom that came with being behind the wheel. As I continued westward, I encountered a series of challenges. Unexpected road closures, heavy traffic, and even a brief rainstorm. Each obstacle tested my skills and patience, but I took it all in stride, knowing that every challenge was part of the adventure. The road, with all its unpredictability, had a way of keeping me on my toes. After several days of driving, I finally reached my destination on the other coast. The sense of accomplishment was palpable as I unloaded the cargo and completed the paperwork. The journey had been long and demanding, but it had also been incredibly rewarding. I'd seen parts of the country I'd never experienced before and met people from all walks of life along the way. Driving the truck back to the depot, I felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. The trip had tested my abilities and pushed me out of my comfort zone, but it had also given me a new appreciation for the open road and the life of a truck driver. It was an adventure that I would remember fondly, and it had taught me that sometimes the best stories are the ones that unfold when you're far from home and navigating the unknown. Last weekend, I had one of those nights where everything seemed to fall into place in the most unexpected way. It was one of those rainy nights that start with just a drizzle and then escalate into a full-blown storm, turning the world outside into a blur of water and shadows. I had been out all day, running errands and catching up with friends. By the time I got home, the rain was pouring down in sheets. I was soaked to the bone, but there was something oddly comforting about the sound of the rain pattering against the windows. It was like the world was giving me a gentle reminder to slow down and enjoy the moment. I kicked off my wet shoes and changed into a warm, dry sweater. My first priority was to make a hot cup of tea. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I watched the rain through the kitchen window. The streetlights outside cast a golden glow on the rain-soaked pavement, creating a shimmering effect that was almost magical. With my tea in hand, I settled onto the couch, wrapping myself in a cozy blanket. I turned on the TV, but the news was filled with grim reports about the storm, so I decided to turn it off and just listen to the rain. There's something so soothing about the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the roof, interspersed with the occasional rumble of thunder. I found myself lost in thought, reflecting on the past few months. It had been a whirlwind of changes: new job, moving to a new place, and trying to adjust to everything that came with it. Sometimes, when life gets hectic, I forget to take a step back and appreciate the quieter moments. The rain was relentless, and as the night wore on, the storm seemed to intensify. I could hear the wind howling outside, shaking the trees and making the windows rattle. It was a little unsettling, but also strangely exhilarating. I felt like I was in the midst of something larger than myself, something powerful and raw. I decided to take a walk down memory lane and dig out some old photo albums. As I flipped through the pages, I was flooded with memories: family gatherings, vacations, and the simple joys of life. The photos, with their faded edges and nostalgic quality, made me realize how much I had to be grateful for. It was a reminder of the many blessings in my life, even amidst the chaos and changes. By midnight, the storm had reached its peak. The rain was coming down so hard that it almost felt like the entire world was submerged. I found myself thinking about how different this storm was compared to others I'd experienced. It was as if the rain was washing away not just the dirt and grime, but also the worries and stresses that had been accumulating. I decided to step outside for a moment. I grabbed an umbrella and ventured into the storm, just for a few minutes. The rain was cold and invigorating, and the wind whipped around me, making me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I walked slowly, letting the rain soak through my clothes and feeling the refreshing chill against my skin. Back inside, dripping and shivering, I couldn't help but smile. There was something so freeing about embracing the elements, about letting go of the need to stay dry and comfortable. It felt like a small act of rebellion against the constraints of everyday life. As I settled back on the couch, still damp but content, I felt a deep sense of peace. The storm outside continued its symphony, but inside, I was warm and safe. The night had been a reminder of the simple joys, the comfort of home, the beauty of nature, and the importance of taking a moment to reflect. Eventually, the storm began to subside. The rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the wind eased. I could hear the distant sounds of the city returning to normal. I wrapped myself in the blanket again and let the quiet lull me into a restful sleep. It was one of those nights that, while seemingly ordinary, left a lasting impression. The storm had brought with it a clarity and a sense of renewal. Sometimes, it's these rainy nights, with their relentless downpours and howling winds, that offer us the most profound moments of reflection and peace. It was one of those rainy nights where everything seems to slow down, and the world outside is shrouded in a misty veil. I had just returned home from work, completely drenched despite my umbrella, and I was eager to get warm and cozy. The rain had been falling steadily all day, and the sound of it pattering against the window was oddly soothing. After changing into dry clothes and making myself a cup of hot tea, I settled down on the couch with a good book. The living room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp, casting a warm, comforting light against the stormy backdrop outside. I was completely engrossed in my book when I heard a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed out of place. At first, I dismissed it as just the rain, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. I put my book down and listened carefully. The tapping was coming from the back door, which led to a small porch. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate, though a part of me wished I hadn't. I went to the door and peered through the frosted glass, but I couldn't see anything outside. The rain was coming down so heavily that it obscured everything. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door slightly. The wind rushed in, bringing with it a chill that made me shiver. I stepped outside and looked around, but the porch was empty. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something unusual. There was a small, damp envelope lying on the doorstep. I picked it up and brought it inside. It was an old-fashioned envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with a wax stamp. The sight of it immediately piqued my curiosity. I carefully broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it and began to read. If you are reading this, then the storm has done its part. The answer you seek lies beneath the old oak tree in the backyard. Midnight is the hour of truth. I reread the note several times, trying to make sense of it. Who could have left this, and what could it mean? The old oak tree in the backyard was a large, gnarled thing that had been there for as long as I could remember. It was the kind of tree that had an air of mystery about it, with its twisted branches and deep, dark roots. The clock on the wall showed that it was already past midnight. The storm had picked up, with the rain falling in sheets and the wind howling through the trees. Despite the weather, I felt a strange sense of urgency. I had to find out what this was all about. I grabbed a flashlight, donned my raincoat, and stepped outside into the storm. The backyard was a soggy mess, with puddles forming quickly on the ground. The old oak tree loomed in the darkness, its branches swaying ominously. I approached the tree, shining my flashlight around to see if there was anything unusual. As I examined the base of the tree, I noticed something half buried in the mud. It was a small, weathered box. My heart raced as I dug it out and wiped away the mud. The box was old and rusty, but it had a small lock on it. I searched around for a key or some way to open it, but there was nothing. The rain continued to pour down, and I was getting soaked, but I couldn't leave without figuring this out. I went back inside to dry off and think. After some consideration, I realized I might be able to pry the box open with a screwdriver from my toolkit. I returned to the backyard, toolbox in hand, and carefully pried the box open. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small journal. The photographs were of people I didn't recognize, and the letters were written in elegant script, but they were faded and difficult to read. The journal, however, was more intriguing. I flipped through the pages of the journal, which seemed to belong to someone who had lived many decades ago. The entries were a mix of personal reflections and detailed accounts of events that had taken place in the house and the surrounding area. It was clear that the journal's owner had been deeply connected to the place. One entry stood out. "Tonight, as the storm rages, I have hidden something precious beneath the old oak tree. It is a message for whoever finds it, a reminder of the secrets we keep and the stories we leave behind." As I read the entry, a shiver ran down my spine. The journal hinted at a hidden treasure, or at least something of significance. But what was it? And why leave it in such a mysterious way? By the time I finished reading the journal, the rain had finally started to let up. I felt a mix of satisfaction and frustration. The storm had revealed something unexpected, but it had also left me with more questions than answers. I carefully repacked the box and decided to keep it safe until I could find out more about its contents. The storm had passed, and the night was quieter. I returned to my warm, dry home, reflecting on the strange events of the evening. It was a reminder that even on the most ordinary nights, life can throw in a bit of mystery and adventure. And sometimes the most unexpected things can lead to the most intriguing discoveries. Last Friday night, after a grueling week of work, I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. The forecast had predicted rain, and as I drove back from the office, the sky darkened and the first drops began to fall. By the time I reached my apartment, it was a full-blown downpour. The rain hammered against the windows, and the streets were already starting to flood. As I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside, I was greeted by the comforting silence of home. The sound of the rain outside was a soothing backdrop, and I was eager to unwind. I kicked off my shoes, changed into something cozy, and made my way to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. The rhythmic patter of the rain on the window created a tranquil atmosphere that made the end of a long day feel almost idyllic. After eating, I settled onto the couch with a book, the perfect way to relax on a rainy night. The rain continued its steady drumming, occasionally punctuated by the distant rumble of thunder. I was completely engrossed in my reading when a strange sound caught my attention, a soft tapping coming from the window. I looked up, slightly startled. The rain was so heavy that it was difficult to see anything outside, but the tapping persisted. I approached the window and peered through the rain-streaked glass. All I could see was the blurred outline of the street and the flickering streetlights. I dismissed the sound as just another oddity of the storm and returned to my book. A few minutes later, the tapping came again, this time louder and more insistent. I set my book aside and approached the window once more. This time, I noticed something strange, a faint, shadowy figure moving outside. My heart skipped a beat. The intensity of the storm and the darkness outside made it difficult to discern what it was. Feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, I decided to investigate. I grabbed an umbrella and ventured out into the rain. The cold, driving rain hit me immediately, soaking through my clothes, but I pressed on, determined to find out what was causing the disturbance. I stepped out into the dimly lit street, the rain creating a veil of mist around me. The tapping sound was more pronounced now, coming from the side of the building. I followed the noise, my shoes splashing through puddles, until I reached a small, secluded area where the streetlight barely reached. There, against the side of the building, was an old wooden crate. The tapping seemed to be coming from inside it. My initial reaction was to retreat back to the safety of my apartment, but curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously approached the crate, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted the lid. To my surprise, inside the crate was a small, frightened kitten. Its fur was matted and wet, and it looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. My heart melted instantly. The poor thing must have sought refuge in the crate from the storm and had somehow managed to knock against the sides, creating the tapping sound. I carefully scooped up the kitten, holding it close to shield it from the rain. It shivered against my chest, and I could feel its tiny heartbeat quickening. I made my way back to my apartment, the kitten mewing softly as I walked. Once inside, I dried the kitten with a towel and made a makeshift bed for it in a box with some old blankets. I prepared a small bowl of milk and watched as it drank eagerly. The little creature seemed to be more at ease now, and its tiny purrs were a soothing sound amidst the storm. As I sat there, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder, I reflected on how an ordinary rainy night had turned into an unexpected adventure. The storm outside, which had initially seemed so oppressive, had brought with it a small, unexpected gift. The kitten, now curled up and content in its makeshift bed, had turned my quiet night into something special. The rain continued to fall throughout the night, its rhythm providing a comforting backdrop to the warmth and security of my apartment. As I eventually drifted off to sleep, the kitten nestled beside me. I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm had transformed a routine evening into a memorable experience, reminding me that even on the dreariest nights, there can be moments of unexpected joy and connection. A few nights ago, my friend Jamie and I found ourselves craving something a bit indulgent after a long day. We had been working on a project together and decided that a late-night McDonald's run was just what we needed to unwind. It was around 11 p.m., and as we finished up our work, our stomachs started growling, reminding us of our craving for fries and burgers. We hopped into my car and headed towards the nearest McDonald's. It was a clear night, and the city lights flickered as we drove through the streets. Jamie, who had a knack for finding interesting local spots, had insisted that this particular McDonald's was a hidden gem. I had my doubts, but I was willing to go along for the ride. As we pulled into the parking lot, we noticed that the restaurant was fairly busy for the time of night. The drive-through line was long, so we decided to go inside. The warm, golden glow of the restaurant was a welcome sight against the cool night air. We walked in, and the familiar smell of fries and burgers hit us instantly. The interior was bustling with activity. A group of teenagers was huddled in a booth, laughing and chatting animatedly, while a few other patrons were seated at tables, enjoying their meals. Jamie and I made our way to the counter, where we were greeted by a cheerful cashier. We placed our orders, 2 Big Macs, large fries, and a couple of milkshakes, and waited for our food. While we waited, Jamie decided to entertain herself by examining the McDonald's memorabilia on the walls. There were old advertisements and nostalgic items from the 80s and 90s, and Jamie started reading out funny slogans and jingles from the past. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and we both started reminiscing about our childhood visits to McDonald's. When our order was finally ready, we grabbed our trays and headed to an empty booth by the window. The rain had started to fall lightly, creating a soothing soundtrack as it pattered against the glass. We dug into our food, savoring every bite of the juicy burgers and crispy fries. The milkshakes were thick and creamy, just as we remembered. As we ate, Jamie started telling me about a new idea she had for our next project. We brainstormed and laughed about all the crazy things we could incorporate. The conversation flowed easily, and we found ourselves lost in ideas and stories. The McDonald's turned into our makeshift brainstorming hub, complete with all the comforts of fast food. Suddenly, a commotion near the counter caught our attention. A small group of people had gathered around, and from where we were sitting, we could hear snippets of an argument. It seemed like someone had tried to cut in line at the counter, and the staff were trying to sort things out. It was a little chaotic, but the employees handled it with impressive calmness. Jamie and I exchanged amused glances and decided to focus on our food. The minor drama didn't detract from our experience. As we finished up our meal, we noticed that the crowd had thinned out, and the restaurant was returning to its usual calm state. We chatted a bit longer, enjoying the relaxed atmosphere. When we finally decided it was time to head out, we made our way back to the car, our bellies full and our spirits lifted. The rain had picked up slightly, and the streets glistened under the streetlights. As we drove back, Jamie and I continued our conversation, now about the new ideas we had come up with and our plans for the coming days. That night's McDonald's adventure turned out to be more than just a late-night snack run. It was a reminder of the simple pleasures in life and the joy of sharing moments with friends. Sometimes, it's not just about the food, but the company and the unexpected fun that comes along the way. When we finally arrived home, Jamie and I parted ways with smiles on our faces, already planning our next outing. The rainy night and the bustling McDonald's had made for a memorable evening, and I knew it was a story we'd be laughing about for a long time. Last Friday night, after a particularly exhausting week, my friend Sarah and I decided we needed a break. The week had been long and stressful, and we were both craving comfort food. As we brainstormed where to go, McDonald's came to mind, a classic choice for a late-night craving. We set off around 11 p.m., with Sarah driving and me navigating. The city streets were quiet, and the occasional raindrop tapped against the windshield. The glow of the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting a calming, almost nostalgic light over our journey. When we pulled into the McDonald's parking lot, the familiar golden arches were a welcome sight. The restaurant was open 24/7, which made it our perfect destination. We entered, greeted by the warm, inviting smell of fries and burgers. The place was nearly empty except for a few other late-night patrons, which made it feel even more like our own little retreat from the world. Sarah and I approached the counter and perused the menu. The options seemed endless, and we were both hungry enough to consider ordering nearly everything. After a bit of deliberation, we settled on a classic McChicken meal for each of us, along with a large order of fries and a couple of milkshakes. Sarah opted for a chocolate shake while I went for the vanilla one. We found a booth in the corner and set up camp. As we waited for our order, we chatted about the week's events, work frustrations, funny incidents, and upcoming plans. There was something incredibly comforting about sitting there, away from the usual stress of our lives, enjoying the simplicity of fast food and good company. When our food arrived, it was like a little feast. We dug into our burgers and fries with gusto, savoring every bite. The warm, crispy fries and the soft, juicy McChicken sandwiches were exactly what we needed. The milkshakes were thick and indulgent, providing the perfect sweet ending to our meal. As we ate, the restaurant's soft background music and the low hum of conversation created a soothing atmosphere. We talked and laughed, reminiscing about old memories and planning future adventures. There was a sense of camaraderie in our conversation that made the evening feel special, even if it was just a late-night trip to McDonald's. Midway through our meal, a group of teenagers came in, their energy contrasting with the calm of the late night. They were loud and animated, clearly enjoying their own late-night hangout. Their presence added a touch of liveliness to the otherwise serene setting, and Sarah and I couldn't help but smile at their exuberance. After we finished our meal, we lingered for a bit, enjoying the last of our milkshakes and chatting about random topics. The night had turned out to be a perfect escape from our hectic lives, a reminder that sometimes the simplest pleasures, like a late-night McDonald's run with a friend, can be the most satisfying. As we left, we thanked the staff and headed back to the car. The rain had stopped, and the city streets were now glistening under the streetlights. The drive back was filled with a sense of contentment, the kind that only comes from a night well spent with a good friend and good food. When I finally got home, I felt a sense of peace. The night had been a much-needed break, a reminder that even in the midst of a busy life, taking time to enjoy simple moments can make all the difference. Sarah and I agreed that we needed to do this more often, taking time out for each other, even if it's just a late-night trip to McDonald's. Last Saturday night, after a grueling week of meetings and deadlines, my friend Jake and I decided we needed a break. We were both craving something indulgent and comforting, so we agreed that KFC was the perfect choice. It was late, and we knew that our usual spots might be closed, but KFC was known for its late hours, and we were counting on it. Jake picked me up around 11 p.m., and we set off on our adventure. The city had quieted down, and the streets were almost empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The cool night air was refreshing, and the excitement of getting our hands on some fried chicken lifted our spirits. As we drove, We chatted about our week and shared stories about the latest happenings in our lives. It was one of those conversations where you can talk about anything and everything, and time seems to slip away. The drive felt relaxing, and by the time we reached the KFC, we were both eagerly anticipating our meal. We pulled into the parking lot, and there it was, KFC, its bright red and white sign gleaming in the night. The familiar aroma of fried chicken wafted out as we approached the entrance. The restaurant was still open with a few other patrons inside. The warmth and comforting smell of the place were a welcome relief from the chilly night air. We entered and made our way to the counter. The menu was as tempting as ever, with all the classic options and some new items that had recently been added. After a bit of back and forth, we decided on a bucket of the Colonel's original recipe chicken, some mashed potatoes with gravy, coleslaw, and of course, a large order of biscuits. Jake also grabbed a couple of the new spicy chicken sandwiches he'd been wanting to try. We found a booth near the back of the restaurant, settled in, and eagerly awaited our food. As we waited, we noticed the quiet hum of the restaurant and the soft chatter of the few other diners. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air. Everyone seemed to be enjoying their own late-night treat, making it feel like a small, shared escape from the day. When our food finally arrived, it was like a feast. The bucket of chicken was golden and crispy, the mashed potatoes were creamy and rich, and the biscuits were warm and flaky. We dug in with gusto, savoring every bite. The crispy chicken skin, the savory gravy, and the soft, buttery biscuits were everything we had hoped for and more. As we ate, we continued our conversation, reminiscing about old times and discussing future plans. The food was incredible, and the combination of good company and indulgent comfort food made for a perfect night. We even tried the spicy chicken sandwiches, which were just the right amount of heat, crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside, and packed with flavor. At one point, a group of friends came in, clearly excited about their own late-night KFC run. Their laughter and animated conversations added a lively atmosphere to the restaurant, and it felt like the night was filled with small moments of joy and connection. After we finished our meal, we lingered for a bit, chatting and enjoying the last of our drinks. The night had turned out to be more than just a food run. It was a chance to unwind and catch up in a relaxed setting. When we finally left, we were both satisfied and content, with our hunger and stress from the week thoroughly addressed. As Jake drove me home, we talked about how sometimes the simplest outings, like a late-night trip to KFC, can turn into memorable experiences. The restaurant, with its late-night charm and comforting food, had provided the perfect backdrop for a much-needed break. We agreed that it was exactly what we needed to recharge and reconnect. When I got home, I felt a deep sense of relaxation and gratitude. The night had been a reminder of how good it feels to take a break from the routine and indulge in something comforting, even if it's just a bucket of fried chicken and some good company. It was one of those weeks where everything seemed to pile up: work deadlines, personal errands, and just the general hustle and bustle of life. By the time Friday night rolled around, I was completely wiped out. My friend Jess and I decided we needed some comfort food to get us through the end of the week. As we debated our options, KFC came up, and it sounded like the perfect remedy for our exhaustion. We left my place around midnight, Jess behind the wheel and me navigating. The city had settled into a quiet lull, and the streets were slick with recent rain. The occasional passing car reflected the streetlights, creating a shimmer on the asphalt that made the drive feel almost dreamlike. When we arrived at KFC, the iconic red and white sign was like a beacon of comfort. The restaurant was surprisingly busy for such a late hour, but the line moved quickly. We approached the counter, both of us trying to decide on our ultimate comfort food feast. After much deliberation, we settled on the classic KFC bucket of chicken. We added a couple of sides, mashed potatoes with gravy, coleslaw, and a biscuit each. Jess went for a chocolate milkshake while I opted for a sweet tea. The anticipation of digging into that crispy, seasoned chicken made us both forget about the long week. We grabbed our food and found a booth near the back of the restaurant. The warmth from the heater was a pleasant contrast to the cool night air we had just left behind. We spread out our feast on the table and dug in, the aroma of fried chicken, buttery biscuits, and tangy coleslaw filling the air. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. We laughed about the week's mishaps, shared funny stories from work, and even started planning a weekend getaway. The comfort of the KFC meal combined with our easy banter made the night feel like a small escape from reality. It was a simple pleasure, but one that was deeply satisfying. The restaurant's soft background music and the hum of the fryer created a cozy ambience. The occasional chatter of other patrons added to the relaxed vibe. Jess and I took our time savoring each bite, enjoying the crispy, flavorful chicken and the rich, creamy sides. It was one of those moments where everything felt just right, despite the chaos of the week. In the midst of our meal, a family came in with 2 young children. The kids were wide-eyed with excitement, eagerly chattering about their favorite menu items. Their energy and enthusiasm were contagious, and Jess and I couldn't help but smile at their joy. It was a reminder of how something as simple as a late-night trip to KFC could bring happiness to people of all ages. After we finished our meal, we lingered for a bit, chatting and sipping on our drinks. The food had hit the spot, and the company made it all the more enjoyable. Jess and I both agreed that this late-night KFC run was exactly what we needed to recharge. As we left the restaurant, the night air was crisp and refreshing. The drive back was peaceful, with the city lights twinkling in the distance. Jess and I talked about how we should make these late-night food adventures a regular thing. Sometimes, it's the little things that bring the most joy. When I finally got home, I felt a sense of contentment that lingered long after the meal. The night had been a reminder that even amidst the hectic pace of life, taking time for simple pleasures and good company could make everything seem a little bit better. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, the kind where you're not really sure what to do with yourself. The week had been draining, and all I wanted was to relax and indulge in something comforting. My phone buzzed, and it was my friend, Aisha. She had the same thought as me and texted, "I'm craving KFC. Wanna go?" Aisha and I had this unspoken understanding when it came to food. We both loved our comfort meals, and KFC had been our go-to spot for years. Without hesitation, I replied, "Absolutely, let's go." Aisha picked me up around 3 p.m., and we headed to our favorite KFC, which wasn't too far from my place. The sun was shining, but there was a cool breeze that made the day perfect for a little outing. As we drove, we talked about everything and nothing: work, random gossip, and our weekend plans. We arrived at KFC, and just the sight of the place made my stomach growl. The familiar red and white sign was like a beacon calling us in. We walked in, greeted by the mouth-watering aroma of fried chicken. The restaurant was moderately busy, with families, couples, and a few solo diners scattered around. We made our way to the counter, already knowing what we wanted. "I'll have the Zinger burger meal, large with extra fries," I told the cashier, not needing to look at the menu. Aisha went for her usual hot wings and a side of coleslaw. We decided to share a bucket of original recipe chicken because, well, why not? With our trays loaded, we found a cozy booth by the window. The sun streamed in, making the atmosphere bright and cheerful. As soon as we sat down, we dug in. The first bite of my Zinger burger was heavenly. The crispy chicken, the spicy sauce, the fresh lettuce, all perfectly balanced. Aisha was equally enjoying her hot wings, and we both couldn't resist stealing pieces from the shared bucket. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as it always did with Aisha. We talked about everything from the latest movies to our most recent Netflix binges. It was one of those moments where time seemed to slow down, and all that mattered was the present. The delicious food, the easy conversation, and the comfort of a good friend's company. As we worked our way through the meal, I couldn't help but notice how much we were laughing. It was the kind of laughter that left you breathless, the kind that felt good for the soul. Aisha had this way of turning the simplest things into hilarious anecdotes, and today was no exception. Halfway through our meal, a group of kids entered, clearly excited about their day out. Their energy was contagious, and we watched as they eagerly ordered their meals, their faces lighting up when they received their trays. It reminded us of our own younger days, when a trip to KFC felt like the ultimate treat. As we finished our meal, we sat back, satisfied and content. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm, golden light across the restaurant. Aisha and I shared a moment of comfortable silence, just soaking in the atmosphere. There was something special about these simple outings. No grand plans, no elaborate activities, just good food and good company. After lingering for a while, we decided it was time to head out. We packed up the leftover chicken, because there's no way we were leaving without it, and made our way to the car. The drive back was filled with the same easy conversation, a sense of fulfillment settling in as we recapped our little adventure. When Aisha dropped me off at home, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. The day had been exactly what I needed: a break from the routine, a chance to unwind, and most importantly, time spent with a friend who always knew how to make me smile. As I walked into my apartment with the leftover KFC in hand, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Sometimes it's the simplest things: a trip to KFC, a good laugh with a friend, that make life feel rich and full. And as I settled in for the evening, I knew that today was one of those days I'd remember with a smile for a long time. A few months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip. We all needed a break from our busy lives, and the idea of spending a weekend in the wilderness seemed perfect. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Ollie, and our 2 buddies Faisal and Rizwan. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, picking the perfect spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual camping sites. We wanted solitude, an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. We packed our gear and set off early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but scenic, with winding roads leading us deeper into the forest. As we ventured further, the trees grew denser, and the signs of civilization faded away. After what felt like hours, we finally reached our destination. An old, almost forgotten campground that hadn't seen many visitors in years. It was exactly what we were looking for. Remote, quiet, and surrounded by nature. We set up our tents near a small clearing by a creek. The sound of the running water was soothing, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine. We spent the afternoon exploring the area, gathering firewood, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. By the time the sun began to set, we had a roaring fire going, and we were ready to relax. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The darkness around us felt thick, almost tangible, as if the forest itself was closing in. But with the fire crackling and the company of my friends, I felt safe. That was until Faisal mentioned something strange. "Did you guys notice how quiet it is?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. We all paused, listening. He was right. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the rustling of leaves were absent. It was eerily silent, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. "Maybe it's just because we're so deep in the woods," Rizwan suggested, but there was an edge to his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. We decided to turn in for the night, hoping that some rest would shake off the strange vibe. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to get comfortable. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept wandering back to the silence outside. Hours later, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, almost like the whisper of the wind, but it quickly grew louder. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the ground, moving slowly around our campsite. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps were unmistakable, circling our tents, pausing every few steps as if whoever or whatever was out there was deliberately taking its time. I glanced over at Ali's tent, which was pitched right next to mine. I could see the faint outline of his form through the fabric, and I could tell he was awake too, lying completely still. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, out of nowhere, a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. Inhuman, terrifying, and filled with malice. I felt my heart race, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. All I knew was that we were not alone. Suddenly, the growl was followed by a loud thud, as if something heavy had hit the ground. The fire, which had burned low during the night, suddenly flared up, casting long, flickering shadows against the trees. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, but they were too fast, too elusive to make out. Panic set in. I wanted to call out to my friends, but fear had gripped my throat, rendering me silent. I could hear the others shifting in their tents, equally terrified. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The fire dimmed once more, and the forest returned to its unnatural stillness. For what felt like hours, we lay there, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and despite the fear, I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream. But the looks on my friends' faces told me it hadn't been a dream at all. We packed up in silence, the cheerful atmosphere from the day before completely gone. None of us wanted to talk about what had happened, and we left the campground as quickly as we could. As we drove away, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. It looked so normal in the daylight, but I knew better. Whatever had been out there with us that night wasn't something that could be explained. It was something old, something that belonged to the forest and didn't appreciate our presence. We haven't spoken about that night since, but the memory lingers, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. It all started as a simple idea, just a weekend getaway in the woods to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. My friends and I had been talking about going camping for months, and we finally set a date. There were 4 of us, me, Sarah, Jake, and Ryan. We'd been friends since college, and this trip was supposed to be a chance to reconnect. We chose a spot deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. It was perfect, peaceful, secluded, and surrounded by nature. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. We quickly set up our tents, built a fire, and started preparing for the night. As dusk fell, the atmosphere shifted. The woods, which had seemed so inviting in the daylight, now felt eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But we didn't pay much attention to it. We were too busy laughing, roasting marshmallows, and telling stories. It wasn't until the sun had fully set, plunging us into darkness, that things started to feel off. The fire was our only source of light, and beyond its glow, the forest was pitch black. The silence grew more intense, almost oppressive. I could sense it too, the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice cutting through our conversation. We all paused, listening intently. At first, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. But then, faintly, we heard it. A distant, low moan, almost like the wind but somehow different. Ryan shrugged it off. "It's just the wind, or maybe an animal. We're in the woods, after all." But something about that sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the wind, and deep down I think we all knew it. Still, we tried to brush it off, not wanting to ruin the night. But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Around midnight, The fire started to die down, and the temperature dropped. We decided to call it a night and headed to our tents. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying that strange sound, and every little noise outside made my heart race. Just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it again, the moaning sound, but this time it was closer, much closer. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound was definitely coming from the woods, just beyond our campsite. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, circling around us. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I saw the glow of flashlights as Sarah, Jake, and Ryan emerged from their tents, their faces pale and tense. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. We stood there in the cold night, huddled together, shining our flashlights into the darkness. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I scanned the tree-line, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, we saw it. A figure tall and shadowy, standing motionless between the trees. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, piercing through the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching us. "Run!" Ryan shouted, snapping us out of our paralysis. We bolted towards the car, abandoning our tents and gear. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't dare look back. The figure didn't chase us, but the sense of dread followed us all the way to the car. We sped down the dirt road, not stopping until we were miles away from the campsite. No one spoke. We were too shaken, too terrified to say anything. It wasn't until we reached the safety of a gas station, hours later, that we finally caught our breath. We never talked about what happened that night, and we never went back to that campsite. The trip was supposed to be a fun escape, but instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. I don't know what we saw in those woods, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was out there, something that shouldn't have been. It all started as a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my two closest friends, and the idea of spending a few nights under the stars, away from the chaos of our everyday lives. We had been talking about going camping for months, and finally, the stars aligned, and we found a free weekend. The plan was to drive out to a remote campground deep in the woods, a place where we could truly disconnect and enjoy nature. We set out early on a Friday morning, the car packed with all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and of course plenty of marshmallows for us s'mores. The drive itself was uneventful, with winding roads leading us deeper into the forest. The further we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw, and soon enough, it felt like we were in another world entirely. By the time we arrived at the campground, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a crystal-clear lake just a short walk away. We quickly set up our tents and started a fire, eager to settle in and enjoy our first night in the wilderness. As darkness fell, the woods around us came alive with the sounds of nature. The crackling of the fire, the distant hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze all blended together, creating a peaceful, almost hypnotic atmosphere. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, laughing and feeling a sense of freedom we hadn't experienced in a long time. But as the night wore on, that peaceful feeling began to shift. The fire started to die down, and the shadows around us grew darker, deeper. The once comforting sounds of the forest took on a more ominous tone, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, feeling a strange unease settling in. One of my friends, Mark, must have sensed it too because he suggested we turn in for the night. We agreed, albeit reluctantly, and after dousing the fire, we retreated to our tents. The air inside was cool, and the familiar smell of earth and pine filled my senses as I zipped up the tent flap and settled into my sleeping bag. I tried to sleep, but something kept me awake. Maybe it was the unfamiliar surroundings, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent, listening to the sounds outside. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it whispering through the trees, carrying with it the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone or something was moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. My heart started to race, and I quickly sat up, listening intently. The footsteps continued, crunching on the dry leaves and twigs. I wanted to wake Mark and our other friend, Emily, but I was frozen in place, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and there was silence. An eerie, suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but the silence stretched on. Just when I thought it was over, a loud, piercing scream shattered the stillness, echoing through the trees and sending a jolt of terror through me. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, bursting out into the cold night air. Mark and Emily were already outside, their faces pale in the dim light of the moon. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my eyes darting around the dark woods, trying to see anything that could explain the scream. But there was nothing, just the dark, impenetrable forest stretching out in all directions. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." None of us argued. We quickly packed up our things, our hands shaking as we shoved our gear into our backpacks. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, and all I could think about was getting out of those woods as fast as possible. As we made our way back to the car, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move with us, and the once familiar sounds of the forest had taken on a menacing edge. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a fresh wave of fear through me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see something or someone following us. Finally, we reached the car, and we all piled in, slamming the doors behind us. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but he finally got the engine started. We tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as we sped down the winding road, away from the campsite, away from whatever had been out there in the woods. We didn't stop until we were back in the city. The familiar sights and sounds of civilization, a stark contrast to the terror we had just experienced. None of us spoke much on the drive back, and when we finally parted ways, we did so with a sense of relief that we had made it out of those woods alive. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night, whether it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us, or something more sinister lurking in those woods. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going camping again anytime soon. It all started as a spontaneous weekend getaway. My friend, Ali, and I had been talking about going camping for months, and finally, we both had a free weekend. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and headed out early Saturday morning to a remote spot deep in the woods. The campsite was about a 2-hour drive from the city, far enough to feel completely disconnected from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The weather was perfect, clear skies and a cool breeze that made the long drive enjoyable. We arrived at the campsite by midday, a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was exactly what we had been looking for. Peace, quiet, and a break from reality. We set up our tent near a small clearing that overlooked a stream. It was picturesque, like something out of a nature magazine. After getting everything ready, we decided to explore the surrounding woods before it got too dark. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely trickles through the thick canopy of leaves. It was beautiful but also a bit eerie, with the shadows of the trees stretching long across the forest floor. As we walked, we talked about everything: work, life, and our plans for the future. The conversation flowed easily, but there was an underlying tension in the air, something neither of us could quite put our finger on. Maybe it was the isolation, or perhaps just the natural unease that comes with being so far from civilization. We made it back to the campsite just as the sun was starting to set. The golden light filtering through the trees gave the woods an almost magical feel, but it also reminded us that night was approaching. We gathered some firewood and got a campfire going, the crackling flames providing warmth and light as the temperature began to drop. We cooked our dinner over the fire, laughing and telling stories as the night grew darker. The stars were out in full force, the sky a blanket of twinkling lights. It was the kind of night that felt infinite, where time seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of you. But as the night wore on, that earlier unease began to creep back in. The woods around us seemed darker, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made us jump. We tried to brush it off, blaming it on our overactive imaginations, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. We doused the fire and crawled into the tent, zipping it up tight. The silence outside was oppressive, the kind that made you strain your ears just to catch any sound. Lying there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible noise, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I nudged Ollie, who had already fallen asleep, and whispered, "Do you hear that?" He grumbled something about it being nothing, probably just an animal, but I wasn't so sure. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. They circled the tent, slow and steady, as if whoever or whatever was out there was taking their time. We both sat up, our breaths shallow. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, a soft scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging a hand across the fabric of the tent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline kicking in. I whispered to Ollie, "Should we check?" But before we could make a move, the scraping stopped and the footsteps retreated, disappearing into the distance. We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled together in the tent, clutching the flashlight and a pocket knife we had packed more out of habit than necessity. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. We didn't hear anything else, but the fear lingered, gnawing at us. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up our gear as quickly as possible, eager to leave the campsite behind. We didn't talk much as we loaded the car, both of us too shaken by the night's events to process what had happened. Driving back to the city, the tension began to lift, but the memory of that night stayed with us. We never found out what or who was out there in the woods, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing's for sure, it'll be a long time before we go camping again. I had been working as a pizza delivery driver for a few months now. It was a pretty straightforward gig. Pick up pizzas, drop them off, collect the cash, and repeat. The pay was decent, and the hours were flexible, so I didn't have much to complain about. That is, until last Friday night. It was around 10 p.m., and I was finishing up my shift. It had been a busy evening, with orders coming in non-stop. I was looking forward to clocking out and heading home when the manager called me over for one last delivery. "Hey, we just got one more order. It's a bit out of the way, but if you take it, I'll let you off early tomorrow," he said with a tired smile. I agreed, thinking it wouldn't be too bad. I grabbed the pizza, punched the address into my GPS, and set off. The address was on the outskirts of town, in an area I wasn't too familiar with. The further I drove, the more isolated it felt. The houses became fewer and farther between, and the streetlights grew dimmer. After about 20 minutes, I finally reached the destination. It was an old, dilapidated house at the end of a long, winding road. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, with overgrown weeds and broken windows. I double-checked the address, hoping I'd made a mistake, but it matched perfectly. Feeling a bit uneasy, I got out of the car with the pizza in hand. The night was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I hesitated, wondering if I should just leave the pizza on the porch and go. But I didn't want to risk not getting paid. I knocked on the door, calling out, "Pizza delivery." There was no response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard a faint voice from inside. "Come in." It was a man's voice, low and raspy. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but something compelled me to push the door open and step inside. The interior was even creepier than the exterior. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. A single dim light flickered at the end of the hallway, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Down the hall," the voice replied. I swallowed hard, gripping the pizza box like it was some sort of shield. As I made my way down the hallway, the floorboards creaked under my weight, each step echoing through the empty house. I finally reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar with a faint light seeping through the cracks. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center, facing the wall. On the chair sat a mannequin, dressed in old, tattered clothes, with a note pinned to its chest. The note simply read, "Thank you for the delivery." My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, dropping the pizza on the floor. I turned to run, but as I did, the front door slammed shut with a loud bang. Panic surged through me as I sprinted down the hallway, desperately trying to get out of the house. But the door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. In the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, and getting closer by the second. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle, praying it would open, but it remained stubbornly locked. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel someone or something standing just inches away. A cold breath brushed against the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. And then, a voice whispered in my ear, "You should have left when you had the chance." I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I managed to break free and bolt out of the house. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I sped away from that place as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I returned to the pizzeria, I was visibly shaken. My manager took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, but when we called the number associated with the order, it was disconnected. The next day, I quit my job. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house was still out there, waiting. And to this day, every time I see an old, run-down house, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. It was a quiet Thursday night, and I had just started my shift as a pizza delivery driver. Usually, Thursday nights were pretty slow. People tended to save their pizza cravings for the weekend. But tonight, there was an unusual number of orders coming in. Maybe there was a game on or something, but I wasn't complaining. More orders meant more tips. Around 9 p.m., I got an order for a large pepperoni and mushroom pizza to be delivered to a house on the outskirts of town. The address was a bit further than usual, tucked away in a wooded area. I'd never been out there before, but I figured it was just another house that liked its privacy. I packed up the pizza, grabbed the delivery slip, and headed out. The drive started off pretty normal. City streets gave way to suburban roads, and soon enough, I was on a winding road surrounded by dense forest. The further I drove, the darker it got. The streetlights were few and far between, and the thick trees made it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. After what felt like forever, I finally reached the address. The house was an old, two-story building, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. There were no lights on, except for a dim glow coming from one of the windows upstairs. The whole place had a creepy, abandoned vibe to it, but I shrugged it off. People have all kinds of tastes when it comes to where they live, right? I parked the car, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the front door. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and the porch light flickered ominously. I knocked on the door and waited. After a few seconds, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching from inside. The door creaked open just a crack, and an old man peered out at me. His eyes were sunken, and his skin was pale, almost sickly. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with this strange, unsettling look. Pizza delivery?" I said, holding up the box. The man nodded slowly and opened the door wider. As he did, a foul, musty odor wafted out, making me gag slightly. I handed him the pizza, and he took it without a word. I was about to ask for payment when he suddenly turned and walked away, leaving the door wide open. "Excuse me, sir, you need to pay for the pizza?" I called after him, but he just kept walking deeper into the house. I stood there, unsure of what to do. Normally, I wouldn't step inside someone's house, but something about this situation felt off. I didn't want to go in, but I also didn't want to just leave without getting paid. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was dark, the only light coming from that dim glow upstairs. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. "Sir," I called out again, but there was no response. I took a few more hesitant steps into the house, and that's when I noticed something strange. The walls were lined with old photographs, all in black and white. They showed various people, families, children, old couples. But in every photo, the people were staring directly into the camera with blank, emotionless expressions. There was something deeply unsettling about their eyes, like they were watching me, even from the still images. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every instinct told me to get out of there. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard a soft whisper behind me. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, this time a little louder. It was coming from upstairs, where the dim light was glowing. I didn't want to investigate, but something compelled me to at least check. Maybe someone was in trouble, I reasoned. Maybe they needed help. Slowly, I made my way up the creaky staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and that musty smell intensified. When I reached the top, I saw a door slightly ajar, the light spilling out from within. I pushed it open, and what I saw nearly made me drop to my knees. The room was empty except for a single old-fashioned rocking chair in the corner. Sitting in the chair was a woman, her face hidden in shadow. She was the source of the whisper, her voice barely audible now. "Help me, please." I took a step closer, and as I did, the chair slowly began to rock back and forth. The woman's head tilted up, and I finally saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and her skin was pale and lifeless. A scream caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, knocking over a table in my panic. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only sound was the creaking of the rocking chair, growing louder and faster. I fumbled for the door, desperately trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me! Stay with me!" The voice echoed around the room, now twisted and distorted. In sheer terror, I threw myself against the door with all my might. It finally gave way, and I bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. I could still hear the voice, now a menacing growl, following me as I ran. I burst out of the house, nearly tripping over the steps, and jumped into my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to get the keys into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I sped away, not caring about the winding road or the darkness. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. I never went back to that part of town, and I never delivered to that house again. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I can still hear that whisper in the back of my mind, "Help me, stay with me." It's a sound I'll never forget, a reminder of the night I barely escaped with my life.